For our next deep dive, we are going to explore the dynamics of cooperation and competition in system development. These are common to use Ulanowitz's word again, agonistic principles in market systems development in our particular field in economic growth, but it occurs in other types of systems as well. So at this time, I would like to introduce FHI Barney Singer to my left here, who will be moderating this session. Barney is known to many, and he brings so many, 20 years of experience, I think it's more than that, multidisciplinary experience as a change leader, educator, and trainer, and he is a well-known expert in capacity building. So Barney, take it away.
Thanks very much, Paul. Is this one? There we go. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here for these very exciting sessions. Building on what we heard on the last panel, especially a couple things that Wayne said and that Pietz said, I have the next heretical thing to offer, which is, what if it's not always appropriate to pilot something and then try to scale it up? Imagine the possibility that every context really is different. And we are actually finding that now, and nobody was really talking about that. But it is a critical element that I think we can add to the conversation. The way that we've been approaching that here at FHI 360 is by using a particular methodology that engages entire systems. Begs the question, well, what's a system? We've been talking about systems all day, but we've actually not really spent any time trying to define what's a system. And I think we've made some assumptions, when, for example, John in the back mentioned agriculture, my mind immediately goes to ag value chains, because that's a very clear and recognized system. But what if we were able to engage all of the stakeholders, both traditional and non-traditional, and consider them a system? Everybody who is affected by a development issue. And that's the approach that we use for selected projects for system-wide collaboration that enables us to actually create a dynamic system that can include, if we use the agriculture example, everybody in that value chain, but also others who might have a vested interest. And that could be people working in environment, people working in the government, people in the media, faith leaders, community leaders from the village level, everybody, and really harness all of that energy. So we've had a lot of success using this methodology that goes by the acronym SCALE in order to do that. One of the biggest challenges, however, is that as a methodology that relies on not only the input of this very diverse group of stakeholders, but it actually relies on their taking ownership of it. We don't know what's going to happen in advance. And that was one of the challenges that was just talked about, the extent to which, either we as implementers or funders like to have a degree of control over outcomes and deliverables. With a system that is that organic, the downside, according to some, is that we don't know in advance necessarily where it's going to lead. We just know that it's going to be led by the people who are going to be implementing it and spurring on its effects, which I think is a good thing, not a bad thing. So it really can figure into the whole question of sustainability in a perfect way, because we're going to leave after we start facilitating this kind of a process, and the people that are actually going to live with it day to day become the face of it and the owners of it. How does this relate to cooperation and competition? If we bring a group together that is that large and that diverse with every different sector, We are inevitably going to be bringing in people whose interests, represent sometimes competing interests. And you know what? That's a great thing. Because in most cases, in my experience, those people are not talking to each other. They are operating in parallel but separate universes. And by actually bringing people together in the same, I'll say room, but it's really not a single room, it's a process over time, we can create a conversation and harness that energy in a way that otherwise would not happen. So we can acknowledge the fact that to an extent there may be competition, but at the same time we can look for those places of collaboration. The last thing that I'll mention about this particular approach harkens back to something that Otto mentioned this morning, which is the point about consciousness, and that it is the consciousness from which people come that make the difference. By engaging people in a singular conversation and having them develop their own common goals around a development issue, we as facilitators of that kind of a methodology can set the conditions for a shift in consciousness. So it's really a way of not only imbuing ownership over what's going on, but elevating the conversation in a way that it otherwise might not happen. So it's something that I'd be happy to talk with folks about after. But what I'd like to do now is look at a couple of very specific things related to competition and collaboration with our wonderful panel here. And they have some great insights to offer. They each come from different backgrounds and different sectors. And I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. So I think, Matt, you are up first, I believe? No? Oh, sorry. Eric is up first. Okay. Thanks very much. Use this one or this one?
Use this one, thanks. So the challenge of going at the end of the day is having your preset points and ideas and thoughts discombobulated by what everybody else has said so far today. It's like, how do I figure that into myself? Oh, I want to make a connection to that. Well, I've got 5 minutes really talking about competition and cooperation in market systems, so I'll basically probably advise to stick with the script. So I've come to systems ways of thinking from the practitioner's point of view, to theory. Still very rooted in the practitioner's perspective and points of view and operations. This has been an exciting conference, this one building off of last year's, and because it's bringing out more about the ideas and the talks of systems. And the idea of competition and cooperation I find also particularly exciting as a practitioner, because it starts to fill the gap of what we mean by systems. I don't know if I'm not going to define that, but I think it's useful as a way of describing what systems are like. So much of our interventions get in and we look at creating specific impact with smallholders and the like, or working with particular businesses in what they do to achieve these types of impacts. But what we're shifting to and what we're talking about here are largely healthy systems. What do systems look like? How do we change the patterns that we see in the systems? And cooperation and competition represent some particular very important patterns that I think that I've seen are indicative of unhealthy systems and healthy systems in terms of generating resilience, in terms of generating inclusivity and the like. So what I want to talk about today is these two patterns as patterns, talk about them a little bit in more detail, where I see them in the system. What are some of the things that drive these patterns, shape these patterns, modulate their behavior, and what are the implications then for practitioners in terms of, well, if we're seeing unhealthy patterns of cooperation and competition, how do we intervene to get the system to exhibit and manifest more healthy patterns? And I think there's probably some connections to be made with some of the talk that Sally was giving earlier about the healthy and unhealthy aspects of systems and those types of patterns, the regenerative patterns. So they are observable We can see them. They're incomplete in and of themselves, but they're fairly indicative of health and dysfunction within particular systems. And I think they can be expressed in terms of being ineffective and effective. Take cooperation, for example. I think what we can talk about in market systems in terms of ineffective types of cooperation, we immediately come to forms of collusion between business in terms of setting prices and excluding others from the market. Where more effective types of cooperation, we would look at areas in terms of especially supply chain management and distribution chain management, especially for agricultural inputs or the like, and how the type of cooperation is manifest in there where businesses adopt particular ways of operating that. The success of your business is depends. Success of my business depends upon the success of your business and the types of cooperation businesses involve to overcome challenges and gain market share and the like. So we can talk about cooperation and see this in the patterns of behavior in terms of effectiveness and ineffectiveness, and same with competition. On the ineffective side of competition, we often see, well, especially in East Africa where I was managing projects last, aspects of predatory competition. So if somebody in the area is being more innovative, getting particular more market share, my first tendency may not be to what do I need to do as a business to out-innovate and become better. Well, my brother works at the local government within the tax office. I know who to go to, how to bring this person down so that they're not in a position to compete with me in that regard. So predatory competition, and it's just one example we see sometimes in effect, where, of course, when we talk about effective competition, we readily understand what we're talking about there in terms of rivalries and pressures driving particular performance behavior. So, with 1 minute left to go, I'm going to skip, seems scalable to a degree. We see these patterns manifest in different aspects of the system, from particular organizational dynamics up to country levels of interrelationships between entities. There's many possible modulators. They seem to come into play with regard to social systems, social norms. Whether norms are how they manage risk, whether they absorb risk, or whether they are solution-seeking in terms of managing risk. These types of things we see as shaping patterns of competition and cooperation. The tricky part is knowing exactly which ones are at play at which particular time. And so for interveners or practitioners, the consequences gets back to the ideas of adaptive management and the like, where we need to prototype our interventions. We need to prototype and have very fast learning cycles about what's happening, build safe-to-fail areas to test these prototypes, test pilots, and figure out ways of amplifying things if they are working, or if we're getting the types of results we're looking for, or dampen if we're not getting the effects that we're looking for. So, with that, turn it over to the next. Thanks.
Hi. So I'll start while my slides come up. Hi, I'm Pietz. In my few minutes, I'd like to take a look at how we as donors and implementing partners in this room can help both competition and cooperation flow better in civil society systems. Because right now, I think sometimes we're more like plaque in the artery of the civil society system, and instead, let's be an angioplasty. If you want to put that on a t-shirt or something, I hold no copyright. I know it's catchy. Unlike the private sector, civil society is propelled by cooperation. What would be a cartel in the for-profit world is sector-wide collaboration in civil society, much sunnier sounding. And cooperation isn't just important in delivering services like the way the NGO Federation in Nepal worked after the earthquake or tried to work to coordinate earthquake aid, but NGOs also work for social change, trying to influence people's behavior and also to influence legislation, like Jordanian civil society did last year when they improved voting rights and voting access for the disabled. These things are all best done by a team of united actors. So we can certainly find good stories of civil society collaboration, success stories, and I'll be talking about networks a bit, although there are many other types of collaboration. But you may have noticed that failures are much more common. Why is formalized cooperation in CSO systems so hard to foster and build? Well, I've managed 2 programs in the field that included civil society network building or support in their scopes, and also this year, here at FHI 360 headquarters, I led a study on civil society networks around the world, and here are some things that we found. One, for a typical local NGO with a small staff and budget, investing time and resources in a network is difficult when benefits are delayed. You don't see the benefit from joining a network for a long time, if at all. Networks need money to run, not just goodwill. It's not something that somebody can do in their spare time. Donors often don't want to give money to network operating costs, and members won't pay fees unless and until they see benefits. Leaders are massively important to the success of networks, especially young networks. And this may not sound surprising, but if you consider that there's research that shows that only 30% of a company's success is due to the CEO, I think that for networks, it must be in the 80s, but I don't have any research to support that. It's just how I feel. A network's focus has to be attractive and inclusive. The Kosovo Policy Action Network that we supported there was almost torn apart as each member organization tried to shove the network toward the issue that they felt was important. It took about a year for them to coalesce around an issue that they all believed in and cared about passionately, which, as it happens, was attacks against religious sites and cultural heritage sites. And then they started to function, which leads to the last point, which is that urgent issues make powerful bonds. Organizations coalesce when there's a strong threat. There's another reason that CSOs don't collaborate, and it's us. We consider it a good practice to give grants and to give money through competitions. And then we scratch our heads when civil society organizations, for example, the 4 that we supported to do community mobilization as a team together in Sri Lanka, fight amongst each other over who deserves credit. Of course they want credit for the next time that they apply for money from us. There is a way that competition could improve the system, and here we can learn a lesson from markets. So in a market, NGO A and NGO B would both offer a service to beneficiaries. Let's say it's advocating for the rights of children. Beneficiaries would choose the NGO that served them better, give them their beneficiary business, and that NGO would grow. Of course, that's not how it really happens. And I think the reason is that there are customers in civil society systems that we work in developing countries, but the customers with the purchasing power are not beneficiaries. They're the donors, and us, the INGOs, the donors' proxies. We choose from among local NGOs who will get funding, and when we do that, we don't consult with beneficiaries. Yes, we do ask beneficiaries, people at the local level, what their needs are, what's important to them, we do needs assessment, et cetera, but we don't ask them which organizations and which activities should get funding nearly often enough. FHI 360 does have a methodology for this, but even we don't use it nearly often enough. Imagine what it would be like if locals could shop among NGOs and NGO services the way they shop for eggs in the market. Now, I realize that I haven't connected my metaphors here, so I'll just say that if you eat too many eggs, you'll need an angioplasty. What to do? And I want to say that I chose this slide background and submitted my slides to the organizers, and then hours later I saw Paul Bundeck's excellent blog post which says that machinery is a bad metaphor for systems. Should be something organic, and I apologize. But for better competition, we can redefine the customers as the beneficiaries, give them more power. When we're considering grant applications, we shouldn't just check the references with former donors, we should check the references with former beneficiaries. We should make applicants show as a condition of funding that they have something that is called a constituency and that they understand that constituency and represent them, which is not a given. We should gather M&E data from beneficiaries, not just counting butts and seats at town hall meetings, although that's easier. For better cooperation, when we want to help a network, we should find an existing one to help. We should give them only the support they need to do what they already think is important, rather than imposing what they should be doing and setting up formal mechanisms that they don't need. We should carefully consider the glue that holds the network together, remembering that urgent and pressing issues work best. And we should build CSO cooperation into all activities. Grants can be structured to incentivize cooperation, so can trainings and workshops and other activities. I think these small steps can help us improve the coronary health of civil society systems, mostly by us getting ourselves out of the way intelligently. Thank you.
Okay, the instructions I was given were to be provocative and not to answer any questions. So no recommendations coming, but hopefully slides are coming. So I'm Troy Etulain. I run a project at FHI called mSTAR. It stands for Mobile Solutions, Technology, Access, and Research. We focus on mobile money, mobile data, and digital inclusion in the developing world. Okay, good. So Cubism, in this talk about complex systems. Cubism was a 20th century art movement that focused on capturing complex visual information and all of its various geometric pieces and putting it all in one two-dimensional space. And I thought that's kind of a nice metaphor for maybe what we're trying to talk about, what we're trying to do. And hopefully if today's event is successful, you will all look like this painting, the woman in this painting, by the end of the day. So my space of focus of concentration is technology for development. And I think it's a really good topic for conversation because technologies, as we think about them, they belie an actual immense level of complexity and how they work. And yet we really don't fully understand how they work and their social, economic, personal implications fully. And yet we spend a lot of money on, like on my project, and because of our lack of full understanding, we miss opportunities and we potentially are wasting our resources. So take, for example, something small, you might have heard of it, it's called the Internet. The Internet governance system was set up in '95 at a meeting in Tunisia. Most people don't know that. And it has a ton of different bodies that are assigned to do different things. The W3C works on protocols for Internet connectivity and interoperability. The Internet Engineering Task Force makes sure that all the hardware we use for the Internet talks to each other and has a similar standard. But just take one piece of that Internet governance structure and look at how complex it is. This actually shows how the US kind of owns and operates the Internet, with the US government there at the top. It's complex. It's complex. We, on a weekly basis, have somebody in Geneva at ITU meetings and other gatherings defending US interests vis-a-vis a free and open Internet, and slowly we're losing ground, actually. Russia and China, they want different standards for Internet governance. And they want to be able to do things in their country which they think that they should be allowed to do. And so you're like, why does this matter for development? Well, it does matter, actually. What they would be allowed to do, with border gateway protocols, or what would be acceptable behavior with intermediary liability. It has effects for democracy programs, the type of which Matthew works on. And we haven't figured these things out yet. The debate continues, and it's stable right now, but really Russia and China are really pushing a hard game. So where is your voice as a development practitioner in this important conversation, this complex conversation that's happening, and where's your voice and where are you expressing your needs? I'm pretty sure that none of you are participating in these activities. So take a little bit more down to what we deal with, mobile phones. This is an image of the versions of Android as they have evolved over time. You can see that Android changes a lot, and you can see how complex the number of Android devices are. This is a 2-year-old graphic. Those are all the different companies producing greater and greater numbers of diverse phones, which we want to use in development, right? Mobile phones. And the graph gets too small that you can't actually continue it in that size. So this is what I think. In our field, there's really nobody who understands all of the details, all of the technology, all of the systems, such that they can apply it in their day-to-day work and development. I've never met anybody that understands all of that. I feel like what you run into is people talking about the potential of technology. People use pom-poms usually when they're like, yeah, it's going to save this. It's clear. It's black and white. I love this flow chart. I tried to find it for my presentation, but I couldn't. There's this logical flow chart of sort of responsibilities and flowing down to one box, and then it says, and then something amazing happens, and then it goes on back to reality, because that's about our level of the granularity of our understanding. So, collaboration and competition. In our world of ICT for D, often something is promoted as open source platforms, open source software. And it's actually, and you think about open source as probably being actually very collaborative. But you can argue a different perspective. One is that because it's a free-for-all, this open source software forks all the time. You get too many versions. You get too many versions of the phone, like I showed before. And actually, there's very little collaboration because there's so much diversity and the source is open. And I'm just about finished, Lori. I think there's actually an illusion between collaboration and cooperation. And that actually they need each other to exist. So here on one hand you have a dictator, on the other hand you have a guy playing football for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, the guy for the football player is a really interesting competition, right? But it's only a really great competition because he's playing according to rules. And so in the terms of everybody playing according to the same rules, that's a form of collaboration. And in a dictatorship with Stalin, there are no rules. He makes them up. And so what you have is think about the economy or the society and how it constantly deteriorates. It's like a lack of competition means a lack of collaboration, and it's like its own slippery slope. It gets constantly worse. So I wanted to make one last point. So as we think about the complexity of the technology we're trying to use in development, the fact that no one has their head around all of the various pieces, we have to take a step back and readjust. One might make the argument that you would have to readjust what we consider possible and kind of slow down our expectations of technology and development.
That one works. Just as easy if I'm going to be up here, eh? So while we're waiting for the slides, I will just tell you I'm Bruce Waltuck, and most of my career has been as a change leader inside federal government. Long career with the U.S. Department of Labor, and more recently as a senior advisor in the agency that is a $3 billion a year grant-making agency on mental health and substance abuse services. So when I was invited to come and talk to you today by Paul, and I was told that this was going to be part of a deep dive session, and you'll see that in the agenda, I'm sure you've seen that, I began to really think about what do we mean when we want to talk about diving deep into a topic, and that's what I wanted to focus on today. So we'll get past this first one here in the interest of time. There we go. So what do we mean by this notion of a deep dive? And these words that we are hearing in describing these sessions, polarity and emergence, around the dynamics of cooperation and competition. Well, there's things that we want to do when we take these kind of intellectual deep dives, and you'll see if you can see the visual image, and I'm not sure, yeah, I guess you can see it from the back. I found images of people really going on deep dives in the ocean. And if you can see at all what this image is, on the one side to your left, there's some branches of coral that look not unlike the image that Sally used earlier, the lungs and the fractal patterning of the passageways there. There's a school of fish in the lower right. There's some rock-looking things in there. What does any of this stuff mean? Well, we want to see beneath the surface, beyond what we see in our everyday observation and interaction. We want to find these deeper patterns that may be there so that we can understand how this stuff works. And we want to then use these new insights and this new knowledge to achieve better outcomes, because otherwise, why are we here and why are we doing any of this stuff? So Then I thought, all right, well, when people really take deep dives, what really happens? And if you can see this image, it doesn't look quite as pretty and clear and appealing as the last image, and I chose this one for that reason. The water is often unclear. The situation is uncertain. Just as we've heard from all of the speakers today, we're dealing with a great deal of complexity and ambiguity and uncertainty as we face these exceedingly difficult but exceedingly important challenges in the work that you all do. Well, we have to bring our own air to survive. You know, when we're doing this kind of work out in the field, we have to find ways to be supported in that work, in that place, in that foreign land, culture, and context. That's not always easy to do. And likewise, we have to bring our own light. You know, the light, in our case, this being sort of metaphoric, of the knowledge and the resources and the capacity that we're going to have to go out and do that which we say we're going to do. Well, we can only see as far as our light will shine. Just as you've heard the other speakers talk about, not any one of us is ever going to know all that we would like to know, or all that there is to know about the challenge, the system, the situation, the culture, the context, what somebody mentioned leverage points earlier, what it will take to get to that outcome that we really desire. And we can only see in the direction we're looking. And that to me was an important one, because all of us are limited by what we believe, by what we know and understand. And so these limitations play out in the ways that we hold our beliefs and hold our values and the ways that we view these challenges and these systems. Again, not any one of us has the magic key. It doesn't exist. And this one I thought about, the farther down we go, the farther into this that we get, the greater the pressure. And I think we feel that as time goes on. Someone was telling me earlier today during one of the breaks about the time constraints. I've got to get this done. It's the contract we have. 1 minute, not possible. You've got to get a different clock. Well, we never take a deep dive alone. These are some things that happen when we really get below the surface. When we're together with other people, we can see more. Our sense-making improves. We may each look in different directions and see different things. What we see may mean something to me and mean something else completely to any other one of you. And there is richness in that as well as conflict in that. We have to communicate. What does this mean and what are we going to do about it? Because again, every one of us has a different perspective, and there's no way to know that what you believe is better, more right than what I believe. When something fails, we've heard this word earlier and many times today, we have to adapt, we have to try something new. Failure is just the way it is. Well, what I believe is that we talk about cooperation and competition. It's a both-and world. These are two aspects of the same whole, which is the experience that we live every day. It's the way the universe is built. And all of life has, I don't call them polarities. To me, they are, it's a word from Scott Kelso, complementary pairs. So it's not competition. What we're really doing is constantly negotiating meaning and response. Why? We want to come up and decide whose version of this is the best fit with the circumstances that's going to give us the best opportunity to succeed. Whose idea is the one we agree is the most sense to try right now. And then finally, how are we going to act with one another? One last thing, and then I'm just about done. A few more seconds, if I may. Sometimes I do in my talks a $1 challenge. I will give $1 to the first person who can come up to me later and tell me what that picture is. Most of you will not know. If you know what it is, don't shout it out. But it's all about point of view and perspective. And so the two things I would ask you to do as you move forward, invite everybody to tell you their story. Somebody told me earlier about, and I won't say who, but or even in what sector, well, we only talk to the biggest players. And I asked them, I said, why? Don't you think that everyone who's affected by this has something of value, both in terms of the consequences and the knowledge and opportunity for improvement that they bring? Talk to everybody, listen to everybody, use all of it to make sense and act together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this terrific panel. very provocative concepts that we've heard. So I'd like to invite forward some comments and questions from the group. Yes, here in front.
My name is Alexander Sarkis. I am an independent consultant now. And I have some systems thinking background. I wanted to say that I think we're not paying sufficient attention to formulation of problems that we're trying to, address. And we often see systems as, things which are associated with an object, a phenomenon, a country, or, a location, a region, a town, or something. But even if we take a human being as a system, the thing that if there is a particular problem, or even a time horizon, if we're looking at a person within a time horizon of a month, so it's one type of processes and one type of systems that generate those processes. If we're looking at 10 years and it's an aging or something, or even 50 years, it's another part of a system which generates that. And we need not always consider the whole system. It's infinite and impossible to, simulate or something or understand. And I want to say that if we start from the problem formulation which we want to address, if it's a problem of several months or 10 years or 50 years, then the problem formulation is a filter itself, which shows us which kind of a system is causing this problem. And then we're kind of narrowing the boundaries of where we look for solutions if we want to have sustainable decisions. And in all these talks about, incorporating systems thinking or complexity, there's, from my standpoint, there's not enough discussion of the problem formulation and, understanding. And from my past experience, it's like 90% of success if the problem is properly conceptualized.
Thank you very much. So for the panel, what I hear in the comment is, where do we start in terms of problem identification if it is in fact such an important piece of the equation and we're not giving it enough time? Where do you think is the best place to start? Bruce? There's a little switch on the bottom.
Better. Okay. So with regard to this issue of problem formulation, I think that there is, in part in this, a presumption that if we can only ask the right question, that perhaps the answer is knowable. I think there may be some truth to that, but not in all of these situations. And I was thinking, when you were saying that, about Lewis and Clark, who started off thinking they're going to find the Northwest Passage to India. They had to reset the compass. Somebody said earlier about resetting your goals, and the map they had was no way, no how sufficient. So they had to reframe the problem as they went along. They had to assess and evaluate and learn and try and ask everybody they met and hope they didn't want to kill them. What are we supposed to do and which way do we go to get to wherever? To me, it's not so much necessarily framing the problem, but in being open to what the stories and the information and the data that we can collect will tell us to inform the theory. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Bruce. Matt?
So that's an excellent question. I don't know what the answer is. I'm comforted by Troy's comment that there are no true experts. I'm just going to apply that to everything about systems beyond the internet. But there are two things that that we use at FHI 360 and that I've tried to use to try to get at this. One is the scale methodology, which Barney referenced before, which is really about thinking about starting right exactly there. What is the problem? Who are the people affected by the problem? Physically gathering them all in one place for a couple of days to carefully go over it, talk to everybody, see what the issues are, realize in the course of that conversation that you left some people out, maybe have a second session or whatever. And really just starting by saying, who are the human beings who represent the aspects of this problem and the solutions to the problem and who is affected by the problem. And we try to cut across government and private sector and civil society and regular people who are unaffiliated with civil society, et cetera. And I'll let Barney talk a little bit more about how the aspects, the specifics of that go, because he's the expert on this one. Another is social network analysis. Now, I would love to hear from the group what their experience with this has been, because SNAs are one of those things that I think look very attractive and they seem like a way to take a snapshot of a system, but they're hard to actually interpret and operationalize. You know, I think if there's ever a perfect understanding of systems, which is something like a 3D graphic, or SNAs will look like a daguerreotype. They're like the first attempt to take some kind of rough sketch. And one of the challenges that we faced, we did one in Liberia, is, you know, the idea, for those of you who aren't familiar with SNAs, is that you're mapping the connections between everybody in a system, then physically mapping it, right, graphically. But you automatically bring your prejudices to that when you start. You start with somebody, and you think, who are the people connected to this person? And then who are the people connected to that people? And you have your lists. But it's like you can make any star look like the center of the sky, depending on where you point your telescope, and then start to draw from there, you know, and SNAs are a similar thing. What they're useful for is seeing where the connections are between groups, who are the connectors, who's isolated, and who you would need to talk to get to other people in the system. But I'll let Barney talk a little bit more about scale.
Do you want to add something, Troy, before I do that?
I think that the problem is not, that we're dealing with is not about the question formulation. It's for the challenges which we see/recognize, for which we just are unable to form the questions. I think that's the biggest struggle. You know, like, we can imagine an idea of God, or we can like think about of an endless universe. Like, there are some topics, like, human beings are, they're a little bit unable to to form the question. And so I feel like there's complex things you can form questions for, and then there's something more complex than that. And I don't have a very formed question. I do agree that, like, we need to be better at forming questions based upon technical knowledge. But what do you do about larger things for which we have human failing, you know? So it's such that you can't actually formulate the questions. Maybe that's a bit too philosophical, I'm not sure.
Thanks, Troy. You know, the one thing that I want to add to what we've just heard in response has to do with the dynamism of systems. No matter where we start, with however we choose the question, we start somewhere. If we're lucky, we're going to answer that one or resolve it in a way that brings up the next one. And that, to me, speaks to, you know, what Bruce was talking about in terms of adaptability. Are we able to be flexible enough and adaptable enough to take advantage of the opportunities as we see them? And knowing who's, you know, part of the ecosystem, to you know, use the term that Otto used this morning, I think adds to our ability to do that. Question in the back? Okay, I don't remember who that was who had a hand up, so.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned, I'm pretty old by now, but one of the things I've learned is about problem identification. When I sometimes have to pretend to myself that I don't know, because I often think I do know, but like actually come from not knowing and then listen with my heart, it's huge what I can hear and how the problem looks. And I don't think we talk, I mean, Otto talked this morning about listening and listening with our heart. But I think it really makes a difference.
Thank you very much for that comment. You know, Otto put so much into a relatively short period of time this morning, and I just want to restate something that he said that responds to your comment. At the top of his U that he was showing, he was talking about how we typically engage and enter a situation with automatically downloading our thoughts, our responses, even the questions. And to move away from that to a point where we have that opening, or that suspension was the word that he used, such that we can set aside those previously held patterns and habits of mind is what they're called in the educational context, such that we can approach something anew. And when we do that, I think we have a better opportunity to listen to all of the voices that might be part of the equation. When I think about voices in this context of competition and cooperation or collaboration, there's an unequal power dynamic. And so sometimes the folks who do not have a strong enough voice get left out of the equation. And so by listening to those, for whatever reason, that have the loud voices or have the financial backing, et cetera, that, as Matt was saying before about our prejudices, that can skew the results, or it can skew the approach that we put together. So I think that being sensitive to voice in that way in terms of inclusion is quite important. So thank you for raising that. Another question, Jackie?
Just reflecting a little bit on the presentations by Otto and by Sally, it seems like there's levers that can be actually sort of found in the marketplace that can actually sort of create bottlenecks or enable sort of better competition, better collaboration in the market. Given the respective disciplines from where all of you come from, what do you think are those levers that might influence, sort of that next paradigm in terms of where markets are going? Recognizing that currently we're actually seeking new solutions that might create a more level playing field with regards to markets.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Gentlemen, levers? Bruce or Eric, do you want to start?
Back on again. I think it's kind of a combination of your question and the framing of the problem question. I think we recognize problems out there. We are calling them insufficiencies, or things aren't as we want them. So framing that then becomes the question. And I think our increasing understanding, or my increasing understanding of systems, the complex adaptive nature of systems, is pointing to lots of ways that for new patterns that we want to see. And relating back to earlier presentation of Sally's and Brian talking, regenerative development are all about certain patterns that we want to see in a healthier system, with the presumption that if we see these healthy patterns, then we are going to get more inclusion, resilience, growth, responsible growth, better environmental resources, use of environmental resources, et cetera. Things that will solve our problems. The trick is looking at, as we identify problems, I think our tendency has been to, okay, what are then the magic levers that we want to choose, that we can find to solve those problems in a pretty linear fashion, where the lessons from systems is that it's non-linear, and there's lots of things involved in that. So what we're confronting now, I believe, are ways of conceptualizing and articulating systems in terms of patterns of behavior, interrelationships, and understanding what are healthy patterns, what are unhealthy patterns, and then getting at ways of of shaping those patterns, helping the system to shape those patterns in responsible ways. Leverage points for that, I think, are still or have been talked about for a long time. I mean, Donella Meadows and systems people talking about policy rule changes, feedback loops, at all spectrums, interconnections between different scales of the system, paradigm shifts in terms of different goals, et cetera, all remain important levers in changing those. The question remains, though, in terms of, for practitioners, what our approach is and how to catalyze those.
So just a couple of comments about this, and first with regard to this notion of levers. in my knowledge, it's machines that have levers. Human beings, I don't know about you, I've looked, I don't have one. Not to my knowledge. So when I mean, yes, there are things that can so constrain us in systems as to compel or seek to compel. And we all do this. We do it in raising children. We did it when we were kids, and we had to try and follow rules. Constraints and those limitations certainly are always present. The other thing about levers is the implication somehow that that person, you the expert or some other expert, leader, boss, somebody, is the lever puller and somehow outside the system and independent of it. They're not. It's not possible. If you're a human being, it's like an anthropologist. Someone I was talking to here today is an anthropologist. And you cannot be an observer and a participant in that system and be completely independent of it. What you say, what you do has consequences. So when we think about being the lever puller, that has its own set of implications. All you can do in these really complex situations, to my knowledge, is act into it. You can try and experiment. You can be courageous and fearless. Do things in ways that are safe to fail. Take away the blame and the shame of failure. Learn from failure constantly. And keep probing, keep trying, keep what works, get rid of what doesn't, stabilize the success, and just keep moving towards whatever you think your goal is.
My answer to Jackie's question would, if I think the common denominator would be something like the democratization of connections. So if you see a system where there are bottlenecks of controls, of flows of information, of money, of decisions, of various types of access, where those bottlenecks are taken away by, sorry to throw in a technology hat, but like the connectivity that mobile money provides breaks down, it removes bottlenecks. Various types of media since the beginning of media, when you have access to information, then people who controlled information previously, they're no longer able you're empowered with information. You know, Uber democratizes access to transport. We had a conversation with the South Sudanese Ministry of Finance on Monday, and we were talking about how the lack of access to money in the country. We were talking about they're about to pass mobile money regulations in the country, and we were consulting on that, and the ability for direct flows of money to break down the structures which are currently control over resources are currently a part of the problem of the ethnic conflict. So, generally speaking, democratization, I think of processes or systems, horizontalization of them, so that people are connected to resources of types.
So, from the civil society perspective, I would say laws. I think laws are the levers which really affect how systems operate in a very concrete, day-to-day way. And I found very convincing the book Why Nations Fail by James Robertson and Darren Ajamolo. I don't know if you guys have read that. But it makes a very convincing case that societies can be neighboring societies like North and South Korea, can be similar in ethnic makeup, religious background, history, food, culture, everything, until the point that their politics change and their legal systems change and their political institutions change, at which point they diverge. And the differences between them are at least partially due to legal frameworks. Now that's just one example. There are many more in the book. And also a guy named Owen Barter has a great talk online if you guys have time for this. I think he's with the Center for Global Development right now, but I could be wrong about that. That looks at this. And you know, institutions persist. They make differences that are system-wide, that you have to comply with because it's the law, and the legal change is slow, it's not very sexy, it takes forever, it's messy, it's never satisfying when it first happens, but they can really have lasting effects. On the civil society side, things like this are very important right now because of the closing space we see for civil society around the world as repressive regimes introduce more and more legislation to restrict what civil society is and does, and it has absolutely visible effects on the entire civil society system. There are ways to work around that, which are the subject for another panel. But I really think that legal framework institutions is one example of a lever.
Great, thanks very much. Another question. Yes, John in the back.
Yeah, I'd like to go back again to this issue of information and transparency of information. So one of you just talked about the advantages of democratization of information. But there are pros and cons in democratization of information. For 7 years, I was a fresh produce importer and broker. And our saying was, transparency is to brokers as daylight is to vampires. So we were in business because of asymmetric information. And once that ceased, then our business model became somewhat irrelevant. I got kicked out of the business by Walmart in 2001 on their mantra, eliminate middlemen who don't add value. Then what happens? Walmart becomes the biggest single retailer in the world, $450 billion in sales, the biggest single supermarket grosser, the biggest single purveyor of fresh produce. And by eliminating middlemen who don't add value and taking advantage of transparency of information, they took over the entire planet in terms of the food industry. So aren't there pros and cons that you should be aware of as you're trying to move towards greater democratization?
Hello? I think one of the cons is that if for societies that are not used to democratized information systems, that the period by which they adjust and evolve and get used to that is a rough period. I think that's a downside. And maybe the Middle East in the last 5-ish years provide examples of that. Another downside is that humans are imperfect, and open and democratized information systems can be abused. And I think another downside is are costs related to making up for where maybe the economics of democratized information systems fail. So the costs in order to sustain information systems, the need to support those costs, we sometimes fail at supporting them. And so because of the reality of, I guess, expenses, we need to kind of support and provide space for more voices than economics would allow. So in our economic systems, we actually we sometimes can fail at truly democratized information systems.
So with regard to this notion of democratization of the information and opportunity and all that, and the pros and cons, it seems to me that any change we make in any system, any movement away from any status quo is going to be a movement towards the preferences of some and away from the preferences of others. I work with mediation in New Jersey and elsewhere as well, conflict resolution. This is a constant issue. People see something as advantaging the other and disadvantaging themselves. And so how are we then to think about the changes we want to make and the impact that will occur on some? And to me, one way to think about this is to look at the bigger system, as it were, and the bigger system being the universe. And in our world, there are pros and cons, there are winners and losers. I don't recall the dinosaurs telling us that they really liked the idea of becoming extinct. They lost and others won. Humans became the dominant species. That was just a consequence of the changes in the system. I mean, I don't know that there's any easy answer to the fact that the changes we implement and the things we do have these consequences. I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
Thanks very much. Anybody else? I think that's a great place for us to end. So thank you very much to our panelists for a really provocative conversation.